Hi, Chris.
Hey,
Uh, Very good talking to you. I know it's early morning in Princeton, so thanks for taking the time to spend 30 minutes with me today.
sure.
I wanted to talk to you about many things, but today, January 20th, is the day of Trump's inauguration. So Trump is going to be the first convicted felon to be elected president of the United States of America. I wanted to ask you, what does his re-election say about the U.S., its political system, but also the Democratic Party?
Well, this is something that I and others uh, have been raising the alarm about for, at this point, a few decades. People like Noam Chomsky, the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, Chalmers Johnson, Barbara Ehrenreich, Ralph Nader, and others, that the expanding social inequality, the seizure of power by corporations and the oligarchic class, which have deformed and destroyed democratic institutions, and I would include the Democratic Party in that, but also the media, academia, the Congress. Our electoral system is just a form of legalized bribery, the decimation of labor unions, the stacking of the courts, not just by Trump with these Christian fascists, but by all administrations with these corporatists who owe their loyalty to this ideology of neoliberalism. This was a long time coming. And Trump is not the disease, he's the symptom. He's what is vomited up out of the morass. And this was pounded home. The danger of these distortions were pounded home in my own books: Death of the Liberal Class, Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, The Triumph of Spectacle, America the Farewell Tour, American Fascists, The Christian Right, and the War on America. And now it's come to fruition. It was completely predictable. You can't carry out this kind of corporate coup d'etat in slow motion and not have severe consequences. And the tragedy was that Biden, or the Democrats, by beating Trump in the last election, the election before this one, had 4 years to enact the kind of New Deal reforms that would ameliorate the very real suffering and despair among the working class. Remember, since 1996, 30 million Americans have lost their jobs in mass layoffs. NAFTA, of course, being passed in 1994. And my half of my family, my mother's family, comes from rural Maine, the state of Maine. I watched what deindustrialization has done to their communities, to their lives, and this is the consequence. It's the rise of a demagogue. They're with fascistic tendencies, essentially embodied within the Christian right, and it's a very dangerous moment. But I would say that it's not so much that Trump will slay democracy. It's more that we've lost the veneer that masks the corruption within the ruling class, and their pretense of democracy is gone. The loss of basic democratic norms began long before Trump.
Thanks, Grace. Talking about a demagogue, how dangerous is Elon Musk, in your opinion?
Uh, I would say the entire billionaire class is dangerous. Elon Musk is kind of the tip of the spear. They will turbocharge what has already been happening under both Democratic and Republican administrations. That's the stripping away of social services, austerity measures. Social Security being the big one. The deregulation, further deregulation of this horrendous for-profit healthcare system. which I think drives 40% of Americans into bankruptcy who have insurance, because of course they can't finally, if they're very sick, they can't continue to pay for the insurance, and then they're just left bereft of any kind of medical support. So we've watched. I read a story in the New York Times yesterday about how all these billionaires are coming in and buying up the prime real estate in Washington, the kind of boutique, super expensive real estate, and they're running out of homes or mansions. So Musk is part of this oligarchic class. I mean, the election between Biden and Trump was really a battle between corporate and oligarchic power. They're very different. Corporate power wants a kind of stability. It makes investments in places like China, Vietnam, Mexico. Sometimes it'll take a year, maybe longer, for their investments to begin to pay back. They want that decorum that an Obama or a Biden offers. Oligarchic power is different. Oligarchic power is about chaos. It's about destruction. It's because oligarchic power makes its money primarily off of rentier economics by setting up toll booths to basic necessities. Again, the healthcare system would be an example, but there are many others. Cities have been forced to sell off their utilities, their sewer systems, their electrical services. I mean, even in Princeton here, they've sold off the parking meter service, and of course, they jack up the prices. So oligarchic power wants the deconstruction of the administrative state, to quote Steve Bannon, because that's how they make their money, whether that's through private security. Everything becomes privatized. Education, that's why you're hearing Trump talking about destroying the Department of Education. Education becomes privatized. And that's what the election was really at its core about, and the oligarchs won. And Trump is surrounded. He himself is an oligarch. He's surrounded by oligarchs, and Musk, of course, is perhaps the most public face. But it's a group of people who are now going to rip the guts out of what's left of our very anemic democracy and our all of the programs that essentially address social concerns and social needs.
Yeah, I also want you to talk about the media. I mean, these oligarchs, I mean, the Rupert Murdochs, the Bolloré in France, have been controlling kind of mainstream media for decades now, kind of buying every TV channels they can buy. But I think for these people, internet became a problem, right? Because it was very hard to control the internet. But we've seen over the last 10, 20 years them trying through laws, but also through like buying stuff to control the internet as well. So we see like, what's his name? Musk buying Twitter, Zuckerberg with Meta, TikTok being banned. How dangerous it is to let these people, and we know their agenda, now control the mediums that usually kind of influence the people. So you mentioned Chomsky before, and his book with Edward, Herman, called Manufacturing Consent. Once you control every means, pretty much, of information, how dangerous it is for, let's call it, democracy or the world.
Well, that's how totalitarian systems work. They control the sources of information as well as academia. Remember, over the summer, universities and colleges coordinated to essentially create academic gulags. Any kind of peaceful dissent to the genocide in Gaza has been met with ferocity. There were just some NYU students who had a peaceful sit down. They've all been suspended for a year. We have the same thing here at Princeton with the 13 students who occupied an office in an administrative building. The rules are so draconian, you can't even flyer, you can't. So it's part of a process by which any kind of dissent is essentially criminalized. And of course, as you point out, the internet plays a huge part in this. Julian Assange wrote a book several years ago, Cypherpunks, on the internet, where he talked about how initially that internet would be able to bypass the control of the legacy or mainstream media, but as corporate and global elites seized power or consolidated power, the internet would become a tool of oppression and surveillance. And of course, that's precisely what has happened. The assault through algorithms. I mean, I myself have been a victim of this. I had a show on RT America, and it was also international, which never wasn't on Russia at all. I never did a show on Russia. It was a domestic program on the collapse of American democracy. And when they shut down RT, my entire 6-year archives of my programs were removed from YouTube. So I covered the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I've done a lot of work on the genocide in Gaza. In fact, I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East since October 7th. And my programs are instantly through AI demonetized um, on YouTube. I had a program on the Real News, and the major donor, T.M. Scruggs, was a supporter of Biden. And when I attempted to hold Biden accountable and the Democrats for the genocide, my show was canceled. So the walls are clearly closing in, and rather than what was at its creation a tool by which we could broaden discourse and journalism, is essentially now rapidly closing. And I think the model is kind of China's totalitarian capitalism. Sheldon Wolin called our system of governance inverted totalitarianism, by which he meant that all the iconography, language, and symbols of the old state were there, but internally corporations and oligarchs have seized the levers of power. I think what we're seeing now is a transformation into a more classical form of authoritarianism or totalitarianism built around the cultish figure of Donald Trump, the followers of Trump. You can only understand Trump if you understand him as a cult figure, not as a political figure. Then all the outrageous stuff he does makes sense. This is the inevitable denouement of society in deep decay, it's was a long time coming, but it certainly didn't begin with Trump.
You mentioned you worked for the New York Times for a long time, including in very high up positions. You resigned from the paper in 2005, and explaining your resignation in 2013, you said, and I'm going to quote you, either I muzzled myself to pay fealty to my career, which in a personal sense would be to betray my father, or I spoke out and realized that my relationship with my employer was terminal. And so at that point, I left before they got rid of me. But I knew that, I wasn't going to be able to stay. I want to focus on the muzzled myself part. Do you think that right now, a lot of journalists, knowingly or not, are actually doing exactly that? In regards to Gaza, I mean, we've got the best example in a way.
Yeah, because they're careerists. I mean, it's about careerism. So I was very outspoken against the war in Iraq. I was booed off of a commencement stage, and then finally the paper issued me a formal written reprimand, which under guild or union rules is what you do to an employee to warn them. The next time they violate that reprimand, you can fire them. And I referred to my father. My father was a Presbyterian minister and a civil rights and anti-war activist, as well as a gay rights activist. My uncle was gay, and my father was very outspoken on behalf of the GBLT community and the oppression, especially by the church, that had been meted out towards them. It was terminal. And what happens, I was told I had written a magazine piece. I'd use vacation time to go to Gaza and write a piece for Harper's Magazine called A Gaza Diary, where I lived with just the great cartoonist Joe Sacco. who did the drawings in a Han Yunis refugee camp. And the paper was apoplectic and told me, although I'm an Arabic speaker, that I would never cover the Middle East again for them. Then after being attacked, and I was lynched by right-wing media day after day, especially after the footage was put out of being booed off that commencement stage. And then they send you, it's like the old Soviet Politburo. One day you have a seat in the Politburo in Moscow, and the next day you're in Tajikistan. So that's kind of what happened. I was just, it was so clear. The message from the paper was, I had been shuttled, and you're right. I had been the Middle East bureau chief. I'd been the Balkan bureau chief. I'd won a Pulitzer Prize. I was pushed off into no man's land, which is how they get rid of you.
And Chomsky again talked about the fact that journalists, when you talk to them, they'll go, no. I mean, no one tells us right to write. We write exactly what we want to write, but the censorship is actually ingrained. So without even realizing, there's also this like self-censorship. They think they're actually writing what they want to write, but they've been formed and trained to write exactly what, in a way, power wants them to write. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, Chomsky was talking about columnists, and in particular Anthony Lewis in that case. It was a conversation between him and Lewis. In terms of on the news floor, you do have journalists of integrity within these organizations, not many, but they're there. But they're constantly fighting against the hierarchy of the system. And it's a very anxiety-ridden place. Of course, it is primarily the people there are about advancing their careers. There are no rules written on the wall, but they fully understand what will the kinds of reporting that will allow them to be promoted and the kinds of reporting that won't. It's very hard to get a job at the Times, or at least it was when I was there. So people don't want to give it up. They like that imprimatur of the New York Times, and they serve the system. I mean, that's why the people who run these organizations are such mediocrities, because they're careerists. The really good journalists are kind of management headaches. So yeah, it's careerism is really the key word there. There was very little daylight between myself and others who had covered the Middle East on the eve of the Iraq War. We all knew it would be a debacle, but they were smart enough to keep their mouth shut because they knew the cost. You have to remember, it was a very, we had drunk deep from that very dark elixir of kind of nationalism and vengeance. And to speak out, I mean, I would come into the office and my phone bank would be filled with death threats. I got mail death threats for speaking out against the war. So, yeah, and the media's changed, remember, since Chomsky and Herman wrote Manufacturing Consent. He was talking about media platforms like the three major networks of the Times or the New York Times that tried to reach a broad audience. That's with the internet devastated that now, and it's siloed media. Matt Taibbi wrote a good book called Hate Inc. about the transformation in the media. And that's so your siloed entities cater to a particular demographic. If it's Fox, it's Republican supporters of Trump. If it's MSNBC, it's Democrats or the New York Times or NPR. And that has further corroded the media because they give the media what they want. So when Trump was first elected, the first time around, digital subscriptions soared at the New York Times, but they knew from surveys that people took out those subscriptions because they hated Trump. And that's how we got 2 years of the fictitious Russiagate. There was no cost for that because it was that decision to bash Trump was a kind of commercial, not a journalistic decision. And Russiagate was, I was one of the journalists who spoke out against it as manufactured as smoke and mirrors, as not real, which of course alienated me from the liberal class. But you had a series of debacles within the New York Times. They had a podcast called The Caliphate, which was based on stories by a con artist who claimed he was ISIS. He never was an ISIS. I mean, I listened to it and it was so salacious. It was clear it was fictitious. That reporter still works at the New York Times. I mean, so the paper has degenerated, and its coverage of Gaza has been appalling. I don't think, although Israeli media has written extensive reports about how Israel killed certainly significant numbers of its own citizens on October 7th. First of all, by targeting any vehicle that was headed back into Gaza, many of which, of course, had hostages or captive soldiers, and it questioned the veracity of these reports about sexual assault. That's not appeared in the New York Times. No, the New York Times coverage has been, I mean, every time they go to a college campus, they search out the Jewish students who don't feel quote unquote comfortable. I don't know how, genocide is supposed to make anyone feel comfortable. Um, yeah, there's been a real deterioration within the media. And it's important to note that when these algorithms are put in place, one of the things they do is essentially funnel people back to the legacy media. The idea is because they're losing subscribers, MSNBC is in free fall, CNN is in free fall, and they not only want to shut down, independent media, but they also want to corral people back into the embrace of corporate or legacy media.
You've mentioned Joe Sacco just before. Many of your books are focusing on the U.S., and you've mentioned some of them as well, and its potential demise. I loved Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt that you wrote with Joe Sacco, and I remember, I mean, I read it years ago, right? I remember going through the book, telling myself, is this really the U.S. empire? Which, the same one that kind of governs the world, start these wars, decides for the rest of us. In 2018, you wrote America, the Farewell Tour. How long can this empire last, in your opinion?
So empires, it can take a long time for a degenerate empire to collapse. Because in the outward appearances, it doesn't appear the foundations are rotting, but the edifice is still there. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. And when I began going to Leipzig to cover the protests going through Checkpoint Charlie, the Stasi state was still apparently in control. And then when it does collapse, it collapsed so swiftly you can barely keep track of it. And that's where the U.S. is. And what I've tried to do as a writer and a journalist is look at the underlying rot, the decay that is eating away at the internal systems of control. I mean, we just saw it in Syria, how swiftly the regime of Bashar al-Assad collapses. That's how empires collapse. That's how East Germany collapsed. I mean, the Honecker, the dictator of East Germany, sent down an elite paratroop division to Leipzig and wanted it deployed on the streets to fire in the crowd. And the Communist Party leadership in Leipzig stopped the deployment because their kids and their families were all in the crowd. Honecker was out of power within a week. So that's how they go. We, of course, are calcifying into a more fascistic and authoritarian system where you use harsher and harsher forms of control to keep a population in bondage. That's also a response. That's terminal in the long term, but it may not be as quick as people think. I mean, you look at the Zionist state in Israel, which is also devouring itself. But it could be around, unfortunately, for longer than we want. And that's also true with the United States. It's very hard to, I mean, those moments of collapse you cannot predict them. I know because I have covered all sorts of uprisings, the intifadas and revolutions and there's something kind of almost mystical about the moment that ignites it. And it's often something very banal that ignites it. So, for instance, in the first Intifada, it was a truck plowing into I think it was a van full of Palestinian day workers that killed several of them and then just ignited. So all of the tinder is there. But we have very sophisticated forms, like any industrialized nation, wholesale surveillance, militarized police. We have the largest prison system in the world. We have criminalized any kind of dissent, and it's very disturbing to see this on the university campuses, because traditionally universities are sanctuaries, places where dissent and free speech is particularly sacrosanct, and that's gone now. And after the genocide, they're going to lift those kinds of rules and that kind of control. So I think it's just going to be a really ugly, squalid, uh, kind of third world country with an oversized military and nukes. I mean, when Arnold Toynbee, the historian, British historian, writes about the collapse of empires, he's writing about commonalities. He said the key is an uncontrolled, out of controlled military complex that leaps from military fiasco to military fiasco. You can go all the way back to Vietnam, but certainly Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza. We are a full partner in the genocide in Gaza. And the military now within the United States is a state within a state. It doesn't even get audited. Half of all discretionary spending goes to maintain 800 bases around the world, while the country collapses. The bridges collapse, the roads collapse. People are living in, if not poverty, certainly chronic underemployment. The suffering among the working class is real, which is why they've all, or much of it, a significant part of it, has embraced the magical thinking offered by Trump.
Thanks, Chris. I want to end with the beginning, maybe the beginning of the end of something else. By talking about Gaza. You've mentioned the genocide in Gaza a few times since we started. We know the active complicity, so it's not even complicity. We know it's a U.S.-Israel genocide, but for the last and fortunately, a ceasefire started yesterday, which will at least allow the Palestinians to breathe a little bit. But for the last, I guess it's about 16 months now, I've been asking myself, not thinking about the media, politicians, the army. I've been asking myself about us, human civilization, and how one way or another we failed Gaza. What is going to be, in your opinion, the legacy of Gaza 2023, 2024?
Well, the global South gets it. It's a new paradigm, because remember, the nations in the global North not only perpetuated the genocide, but blocked the rest of the world from doing anything to either condemn it or stop it. And it was a message, especially with climate breakdown and mass migration and droughts and wildfires, as we've seen in California, and the disruption that the global crisis will cause. We will see these kinds of tools inflicted on those Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. That it's the end of any kind of even pretense about a rules-based order, which was always more honored in the breach than the observance. But now there's not even a pretense. So it's a very frightening moment. And I think what it exposes, let's speak as an American, is that we are Israel. There's no dividing line between us and them. The kinds of things that Israel does in Gaza are exactly the kinds of things we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, including, of course, torture, savage torture, and the targeting of hospitals and medical staff and civilians. We know from the drone papers that most of the casualties in Afghanistan were civilians and no military value at all. So I think it's the harbinger of a new kind of global paradigm that's very, very frightening. And I think most people in the global South get it. We don't, but they do.
Thank you, Chris. This was much appreciated. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.